We so often hear about AI helping clinicians deliver better care, but not enough talk about how. Today, I'm thrilled to have my good friend Dr. Ravi Parikh joining us. Ravi is an oncologist and an associate professor at Emory's Winship Cancer Institute, where he also leads the Human Algorithm Collaboration Lab, or HACLab for short. We spent a lot of time together, and while we don't always see eye to eye, our debates are always fascinating, and I know you'll find them insightful. Ravi has a unique perspective that perfectly marries the clinical with the technical. He's not just a brilliant oncologist, he's also a national expert in using real world data and machine learning to improve cancer care. He's doing groundbreaking work that's not only shaping the future of medicine, but also challenging our assumptions about the role of technology in healthcare. In this episode, we'll dive into how to truly evaluate AI tools in a clinical setting and measure their real world outcomes. We explore critical topics like governance, trust, and accountability, and discuss the essential role of human oversight. We also talk about how ambient technology could transform oncology, creating a powerful new operating system for care. If you're a healthcare innovator or clinician looking to implement AI, this conversation will give you a clear, honest take of where AI is truly ready to make a difference and where we still have some work to do. Let's get into it. All right. So today we have Dr. Ravi Parikh joining us from the Emory HACLab. Hey, Ravi.
Hey, Matt. How are you?
I'm doing well. So why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your role at Emory.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a medical oncologist here at Emory. I focus specifically on genitourinary oncology. So I only see in clinic things like prostate, bladder, testicular cancer, etc. But I spend most of my time doing research. So I run a lab here that broadly focuses on clinical implementation of AI in our routine clinical workflows and testing how to make that work and running large scale trials to see what effect it has.
I know, Ravi, I feel like before I met you, like in person, I read a lot of your work. What was the initial inspiration that kind of motivated you to focus on like this particular, segment of the research?
So I'm not computer science, machine learning trained. My background is in traditional health services research and in running clinical trials, because that's largely what we have access to in training as an oncologist. But I would say the way I kind of backed into this, I had been very interested in care near the end of life throughout even high school, leading up into college. I mean, my first foray into healthcare was working at a local hospice in my hometown at Citrus County, Florida. And that's where I got interested in healthcare. I wouldn't say medicine, I said healthcare in general, because hospice care spans, a holistic aspect of care. And it was really beautiful. I mean, these people weren't people that you kind of traditionally think about as hospice, or my naive conception of hospice kind of coming in, as people who were giving up on care and kind of on their on death's doorstep. These were people that were ambulatory, functional, walking around, and really had the time devoted away from their cancer treatment or other types of treatment to focus on what made life worth living and and to reflect back on what they had done well in their life. And we talked about that. I was largely serving as a bit of a caregiver and a counselor in my volunteer role there. And so a lot of my work there just focused on either recording these people's stories or helping them tell their own stories through video or in writing. But it sort of inspired me to want to take care of patients better near the end of life. As I kind of progressed through college and medical school, one of the key aspects that was interesting and a key area of research interest was around prognostication, because oftentimes to deliver good care near the end of life, we have to prognose better. And our prognostic tools, for lack of a better word, just stink in oncology care, let alone, writ large in healthcare. And that's probably why only about 30% of the time do oncologists get it even close when it comes to prognosis. And usually that, is associated with overestimating life expectancy. So my first foray into machine learning and AI was around just trying to develop better prognostic tools using routinely collected electronic health record variables. Projects that I really became passionate about. It felt like a cool marriage of both technology and kind of high touch care and trying to direct better care near the end of life. And that sort of spurned an interest area that now, spans beyond end of life care and other aspects of AI.
Yeah, I think you offer a really unique perspective coming from like the clinical lens, but being really steeped inside the technology. And a lot of the research that I read from you speaks a lot to the impacts of the technology, but also like the quality and how do you actually measure and govern these types of technologies, which I think in the conversations we've had before is like such a critical piece to making sure that we're deploying kind of these products responsibly. I wanted to start with just that one particular piece of research that you've been actively working on is really how you're actually evaluating AI tools and like what does a responsible kind of governance process look like in practice to you based off your research.
Honestly, I think the question is still evolving, so I'd love your take on this too. But from my perspective, as a clinician and as someone who plays an operational role in data science at our cancer center and helps to vet, certain clinical solutions, everything ranging from, operational solutions like, ambient AI to things to help make our clinical trial efficiency move faster. Usually, when we're getting these solutions, they're not homegrown because most of the innovation is happening in industry, and that's amazing. But most of the time, when we're ingesting these type of pitches or hearing a bit about product, a lot of it focuses on the capability, and very little of it focuses on the evidence behind it. And that's in some sense by design. I mean, we're approached by these products very differently than we're approached by a drug manufacturer, who, even to have permission to come and talk to us, they need to have some level of evidence and permission granted by the FDA. Many of these organizations and companies and technologies aren't necessarily governed by anything, whether it be regulatory, federal, or otherwise. And so I think there's a big trust gap when it comes to the end user clinicians and health systems that we're faced with. Some of that can be solved with regulation, enforcing better standards, or at least meeting minimum privacy standards so that we know that these things aren't going to release patients' information out there in the wild. But I think the more important thing is whether they actually work and are going to make our lives better as doctors or patients, or whether they're going to help improve patient outcomes. And so part of the work that I do is both in trying to run trials to help test whether these tools actually work in practice. And those can be very pragmatic trials, not the typical randomized controlled patient level trials. But then some of my work recently has spurred into the policy realm, trying to investigate what different types of governance structures are out there in healthcare and what kind of purview do they have? Who do they report to? What kind of permissions do they need to have if they're going to purchase some sort of ambient technology or any other AI technology? And spoiler alert, it's all over the place. And we don't have any kind of predefined standards for AI governance in health systems. And maybe some of the work that our lab does and others can help to enforce some of those.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. I mean, in my on my take of things, I do think that there should be at least a shared language in which how we're talking about the efficacy of these tools, because a lot of times, especially in the ambient market, we talk about adoption, utilization, no quality. A lot of these measures that on the surface sound the same, but underneath they're vastly measured in different ways. Usually to embellish some of the shortcomings of the tools themselves. And I think that I think the work that you're doing, trying to create these standardized metrics and share language around how we're measuring the efficacy of these tools are really important. I think my take that is that a lot of times I view that in these processes, people tend to hold technology to a higher standard than humans. And a lot of times, I believe that the benefit of technology and having a bias to action is sometimes more beneficial to the patient than doing nothing. And so I think that's just a very challenging thing to have to calibrate against, because sometimes you know when you have these lengthy governance processes, it ends up slowing down the diffusion of innovation that could ultimately really benefit not only the providers and the patients. And so making sure that there's almost like two perspectives. Like, one is like, is there a non-inferiority test that we're running to make sure that these tools are able to provide the same accuracy or the same kind of benefits that a human physician would have otherwise been able to do themselves on any given random day when they may wake up, have on the wrong side of the bed, they might have a bad day, that is like, I think, the first tier. And then the second tier is like where we should all continue to strive for and have a shared language around where we want to go, which is like the aspirational gold standard of making sure that, hey, like we're holding everybody accountable to make sure that, certain critical errors that we have predefined, we will absolutely not accept. And those are the things that I think we should really focus on.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm curious to get your perspective on that, because I think, in the times that we've spoken, off the podcast, there's been like some interesting debate around that. So I'm curious to get your take, especially on the comment on, what is the standard at which we should hold technology.
Yeah. So let me give you an example. Like, I think we are in such need, particularly at my academic health center, where we're so slow. And I'm not like generalizing about my center. I'm talking about all academic oncology centers. We're so slow at a lot of different things. We're slow at entering records into the chart in a timely manner. We're slow at sharing data with patients in a timely manner. We're slow at accruing patients to clinical trials. We're slow at and inadequate at getting every patient that could be enrolled into a clinical trial. And so for those matters that are like pure efficiency plays, like I would largely consider ambient to be, I think the standard is the bar is a little lower than a clinical decision support tool where, we're working upon what we think of as like pretty good doctors, and we're trying to work above that. Right now, an efficiency play is really, easy to get a foothold in with an academic medical center, let alone any oncology center, because we're so bad at it. And so the pitch that needs to be made from the vendor to get play is one, the fact that our records that we're going to share with you are going to be stored privately and not disseminated, into some commercial database that we have no control over, or that they're not going to be used for further commercialization processes. And that's, honestly, some of the challenges that we have with some AI solutions that are tied to broader commercialization of data is that, data is valuable, and it's also, private, and we need to have all these assurances that make sure that, that it's being shared responsibly, even if there's sort of the carrot of some improved efficiency tool that's coming alongside of that. Same thing with clinical trial optimization and efficiency. I think it's when you start to get into one, moving from the ambient vendor to becoming a clinical decision support vendor, or when we're getting tools that are pure clinical decision support plays, that we start to get a little nervous, because one, oftentimes there's no benchmark to compare against, and we don't know whether this tool is going to improve, not improve, or just result in everything being the same except we're out of the hole for a couple $100,000. Or two, whether that decision support tool actually, how it's going to compare to the next thing down the line. And so much of this stuff is just evolving so rapidly, and still the governance process is lengthy. And so we have to decide whether the investment of time is going to be worth it, even if something better comes on the line like 3 months from now. And that's a tough decision to make, because it's tough for us to see the future.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, like for the clinical, like the distinguish between efficiency and clinical decision support. I'm curious to get your take on like how you would factor in like the workflow of those products to the standard that you would hold them to, right? I think like, for example, like with the efficiency play, especially with ambient, I think a lot of people view that as efficiency, but they also make sure that the quality is, up to snuff or reaches this threshold, because they're, worried about it, like inaccuracies being propagated within the clinical record, right? And I think that's a real, that's a real thing that we need to solve for. But I think the comfort around being able to be more biased towards actions to these tools is given the fact that a lot of these ambient tools really have a human in the loop when it comes to like the physician that's ultimately reviewing that note, editing the note, and putting it into the EHR. And so if you have a lot of these clinical decision support tools that ultimately have like a human in the loop that's, maybe not making the decision on the behalf of the physician, but synthesizing the vast amount of data that, a clinician would have to traverse, and making sure that we're presenting that into their, fingertips, that has the provenance of the data and the right evidence linking and everything like that. How do you think that changes your kind of perspective on, okay, this is just like a pure, telling the physician what to do versus this is, helping the physician kind of understand what the best thing is to do?
Let me take you into the room, I guess, a little bit for when we're actually getting pitched the tools, because ultimately, I think the human in the loop process is certainly reassuring. We're a lot less wary, I think, of tools that by necessity sort of ensure that a clinician or someone signs off on the device or on the output. But as you know from being in the room with the health system leadership, the type of data that we get when it comes to you know allowing us to sort of decide whether to take up the tool, some of it is focused on time savings, decreased pajama time, that kind of thing. But um, I would argue that a lot of the time the quality of the tool itself, whether it be hallucination rate or whether it be even I mean, sometimes hallucinations are actually a good thing if the ambient is putting something in the record that should
Yeah.
be there. So, I don't want to characterize every hallucination as a good or bad, but like actual, clinical decision support inefficiencies or inaccuracies that get propagated as a result of deploying the ambient tool. I think that's difficult. That's difficult to generate that data. I don't think anyone really has in a peer reviewed manner. And so most of the time, the quality assessment framework, if one is presented at all, for something like ambient or clinical decision support or clinical trial screening, operational, if it's presented at all, it's usually confined to these very controlled in silico experiments where we're kind of presented with inaccuracy rates for a fixed domain of things, and we have to use that alongside the efficiency and of course how much it's going to cost and the provisions around data sharing, and we're making recommendations on that front. And I don't want to venture any guesses, but for a situation where a system like mine is sort of doing a bake off or trying to evaluate between different vendors when we're making decisions around which tools to use, I would argue that quality is one of those things that's really hard to compare between different vendors. And so usually the decision is based on, well, do we have a good relationship with someone? Is the software implementation relatively easy? And how much does it cost? And hopefully we'll move to something a little better, down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think those are very meaty metrics to try to wrap your head around and build kind of robust kind of mechanisms to measure those things at scale. And I think, like, specifically Emory, at least my understanding, I'd be curious to like get the real story here, but like we've been doing ambient for since the beginning of dawn, and we were probably one of the first vendors that actually had an ambient solution. And I think Emory was actually the first kind of institution to actually have an enterprise deployment of ambient. And this is much before any of the peer-reviewed kind of data came out. This was, I think, very nascent kind of stages. And I do think that that model is, one that I personally would subscribe to. Is like you do see that bias for action. You're able to make, a judgment call as to what are the real risks of not only the product and the data that the product or vendor is presenting to you, but also like how the workflow of the product works such that you can put in the right controls to make sure it's limiting the amount of exposure to risk. And so like I do think that having this iterative approach of saying, hey, like let's design the workflows and the products in the way so that we can get them in the hands of the patients and the physicians as fast as possible to reap any of the kind of incremental benefits that we're getting with the technology. And then let's continue in parallel to make sure that we have kind of robust feedback mechanisms to continue to improve on it. But in nowhere, I think where I think there needs to be a lot of clarity as to at what point are you gating the rollout based off of clearing a lot of these accuracy benchmarks.
Honestly, like I think we're talking a little bit about a pie in the sky vision where we have some sort of minimum accuracy benchmark for across tools, not just ambient, where we can at least be comfortable having the conversation, and we don't need to kind of go through some clearance because to be honest, there's no accuracy clearance or anything that's happening, at least on the Emory side, let alone at any academic medical center for use of these tools. Usually it's based on either us believing in a solution, us potentially co-developing a solution, or us hearing from other health systems that this is going great and you ought to try it. I think that the situations where we as a big health system feel a little more comfortable engaging in that partnership, and this I can't speak to the previous ambient rollout because It's going on now. It's been going on for 2 years. We're as you mentioned, one of the first vendors, and it happened before I came. But I think the situations where we start to get more comfortable are one when if a solution is early, where there's a sort of a commitment towards sharing data on how things were going, when we can see routine dashboards of how many people are using it, what's the impact on billing, what's the impact on time spent in the encounter, and if there's issues that we can actually talk to somebody instead of just submitting a complaint onto some anonymous dashboard like I do for all sorts of other stuff that goes nowhere. And so like if we can do that, then I think that at least gives us a little trust that like, hey, you're in this with us, ambient vendor or clinical trials vendor or whatever it is. And so even if there's little hiccups along the way, you're committed to like working this out with us. Now I think a lot of the ambient solutions like yours are somewhat mature enough to the point where some of those initial kinks, you can say, we're unlikely to encounter those. But undoubtedly, like being responsive to the customer is always important, and it's just that we're dealing with arguably a lot more annual patient lives at a big health center like ours than some of the routine community practices, and so we need to have a little bit of assurance there.
Yeah. I mean, I think the partnership model that you described is exactly the way that, trust is developed. And, trust, I would say, is a foundation for making sure that, when you're in the business of, risk management, you're literally dealing with patient lives. People tend to be risk adverse, right? One of the recent podcasts that I had with, Sean Kozin, we were talking about how like a lot of the innovation that we use today that we take for granted in medicine, really came from experimentation, right? And needing to continue to be risk seeking in service of patients, in service of finding better treatment pathways, in service of creating a better patient experience. And I really think that partnership model and having that trust, that's the bedrock of that relationship, is what ultimately allows us to experiment faster and really have healthcare kind of embrace technology, which I think you and I would both admit that in the past 2 3 years, we've never seen healthcare adopt and embrace technology like it has. Right.
Yeah, I think it's almost being regarded as like akin to sending next generation sequencing for our advanced cancers. There's initially a little bit of uncomfort, and now we've quickly progressed to the point where if you don't have some sort of in-house NGS sequencer or platform, or if you don't have a very tight relationship with the vendor, then you're regarded as lower quality of some sort. And I think that that's sort of how adoption of some of these ambient AI scribing solutions, and increasingly, clinical trials based solutions, solutions that are around sort of managing patient triage. Those I think are just going to become a little bit more of a marker of high quality care as opposed to some experimental thing that people are trying out. I think you sort of alluded to like, how do we gain trust? And, we have a couple of ideas and it would be interesting to talk through that. But first of all, on the health system side, we need to have some standardized processes that govern whether we take up a solution. We need to have some standardized frameworks for who's going to be those quote unquote decision makers, because our clinicians get really averse to sort of a single person or a single couple of people making decisions on behalf of a big institution. And so having representative governance structures that have a clear defined task, I think is helpful in the sense that it'll have some standardization to what we use. I also think it'll help some of these governance and approvals of tools go faster, because right now the process of approval for a radiology tool is so different than the process for approval of an EHR based tool, and it's different than approval of some other based tool. And we just need, I think, to put some effort into the standardization of the governance so that things can move in faster, or we can deliver a quick reply to somebody that says, hey, we're in the middle of a pilot with someone else right now. Now's not the best time. And I'm sure that would be a benefit to someone like you to get a quicker answer as opposed to being left on the vine like you commonly get left on from a lot of our big academic health centers a lot of the time. So, I think setting up the process is one. And then on your side, or on the vendor side, I think really investing some thought into aside from your product or aside from others' products, how can you put out evidence out there or put out standard benchmarks or benchmark data sets or whatever it might be that others can sort of vet their solution against, so at least we can sort of cross that minimum quality threshold assurance that we need to have, because honestly 90% accurate versus 89% accurate, 6 minutes saved versus 10 minutes saved, like I think even though in the long run those have meaningful impacts, those don't usually make the decision point about whether we take up a solution or not. I think we just need some minimal reassurance. I don't know what those standards ought to be. They're definitely different by the technology, but I think partnerships with academia, I think, are a good way of getting those frameworks out there.
Yeah, I agree. I think the partnership with the academia is how you get, a more common like shared language around how a lot of these things are measured. Because like I said in the beginning, when I read a lot of these peer reviewed kind of journals around the efficacy of these tools, they're throwing around terms like adoption, utilization, and accuracy. And then when I actually look at the methodology to how they're calculating it, they're done in vastly different ways. Like for example, adoption is one, right? Like asking the industry, do you consider if someone adopted a solution if they're only using it for one patient, or they've only used it once? Or are you considering someone an active user if they're seeing 30% of their patients or 40% of their patients? And having some sort of standardization around that, I think is would benefit everybody to put all the kind of vendors on the even playing field. And I do think like the other point that you made about like consolidation in the governance process is important, right? Because again, like with the pace of innovation and how fast technology is moving, one of the things that kind of strikes me is that, a lot of times when I'm in these conversations about governance, it feels like we're trying to like, like perfect is the enemy of good, right? And yes, there might be a better process, but that's going to take us longer to create that better process. It's going to create more bifurcation for depending on what tools, what process to go to. And at the end of it, the net result of it is that by the time you finish that process, the whole assumptions around the technology have completely changed, and you'd missed the first wave and all those learnings that you could have had if you just dived right in and be a little bit more biased to action. So
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, so we just ran, led by a master's student in our lab, an MD and master's student, Vinny Alawalia, who is now a resident. We just ran this survey of AI governance structures across the entire health system. It's currently under review. And our questions were pretty simple. They largely revolved around who's on your committee and what are your statements of task. That was one set of questions. And the other set of questions was, what should it be? And so right now, most AI governance committees, they actually report up to some sort of IT or privacy, kind of structure. They're not usually a standalone committee, which I found super surprising. Because you might envision the kind of conversations that you're going to have if your conversations are being dominated by privacy and data sharing. Of course, that's important, but you lose sight of what the future facing value of the technology is. Second is who's on the committee. Tends to be sort of somewhat clinician and IT dominant, but some of the other factors that you might envision as being advocates of use of certain technologies, individuals from, say, the social work space or the advanced practice provider space, which really would benefit from some automation, the nursing and APP representation, because they follow very standardized pathways of care often, representation from ethics, those are very uncommon to have in the committees, even though most of our respondents said they ought to have some representation. And then in terms of what people actually do, most of the time they're charged with determining feasibility of deploying an AI-based solution, not what setting overall strategy or vision boarding for what do we want an optimal AI solution to look like. As far as I can tell, no one is out there putting out RFPs, or very few institutions are out there putting out RFPs for what we want out of an AI vendor. And I would imagine, given your ability to quickly right-size solutions to a particular problem, you would probably kill for a health system to put out an RFP of what ideally do we want, as opposed to like just pitching a standard product and not knowing what the health system actually wants out of that product. So, I think that there's all sorts of ways that we can put some standardization into, who's on these committees. Of course, like right size to whatever, context is dependent for a safety net hospital versus an academic medical center. But, standardize at least what some of the minimal composition ought to be and what the minimal charge ought to be for these institutions, akin to what the Joint Commission or other institutions do for quality improvement or patient safety committees at hospitals, so that at least we can work up from something, because right now we're working up from like nothing.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think the point that you made around, making sure that the system has a perspective on what they want out of not just an AI vendor, but an AI strategy, right? I think, a lot of times, healthcare adopts technology out of necessity rather than like being proactive about saying, hey, like here are the things that, we can really transform with technology. And it might be because they are either risk averse, or they may not be able to wrap their mind around the true potential of this technology, whatever that might be. But I think the partners that we've worked with, that I think we've really been able to have successful deployments and have been able to also evolve the product beyond what it initially say for documentation, but evolve the product beyond that, are the ones that have like conviction around, hey, like this is where we start, but here is the next three steps of where we should go. Because without that perspective, one of the risks that I see, health systems and provider organizations have is that they end up with a disparate kind of set of vendors that are doing kind of different point solutions along the value chain. And when the power of AI really comes from making sure that all of those point solutions are able to talk to each other and provide each other context of what's happening up and down the stack. And I do think that there is a case for consolidation amongst AI, because I think you are able to have kind of these compounding benefits as you're able to layer on more kind of use cases up and down the workflow, and provide that same context to any point in the workflow. And that's where I think is like probably a problem that health systems might face in the next 3 to 5 years, once they realize like, hey, we have now 100 different AI vendors doing 100 different things, and now we need to figure out how do we get them to all talk to each other in order to get what we want out of them.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's also like an avenue that we can learn a bit from our community oncology colleagues, who honestly I feel like are a lot more versatile at getting solutions approved and implemented, as opposed to some of the complex governance structure that's at the bigger centers. But then also at sort of doing some consolidation around vendors, and in some sense offering ideas for solutions that those vendors don't even know that they need yet, but in a year they can quickly develop. The point about interoperability between different AI vendors is so important. I mean, in our clinical trial infrastructure, which is obviously very important for us in academic medical centers, everyone is pitching us EHR to EDC. So, taking data from the EHR and using that to populate our research grade sort of data entry systems. Different people are pitching us trial matching solutions. Different people are pitching us trial pre-screening solutions. Different people are pitching us trial feasibility assessment. And then those same companies that have access to data may be pitching pharma companies with site optimization type solutions. They may be pitching patients with patient facing optimization solutions. And honestly, like, I think we would be very happy with a platform that just says we can do it all. We're going to start with this use case, and here's a planned phased uptake. And I think that would, one, save us a lot of time, because we don't have to listen to all these other pitches from all these other vendors for these different point solutions. But it would also, I think, engender a little bit of trust that like we're in this with you for the long haul. We're going to figure out our contracting structure to sort of reflect shared incentives over the long haul, rather than putting some sort of upfront huge cost on you, the academic health system. There's a nice alignment of incentives there. And I'd be interested from you, because while it's easy to sort of pitch an ambient vendor as a pure dictation tool that is going to like make your documentation more efficient, the fact that you're able to mine information from the record opens up a ton of different possibilities across a whole other different set of use cases, and making that salient to the to the center, so that we can engage in longer term partnerships, I think is super valuable.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it really depends on how deep is the partnership that these ambient vendors have with their customers, and how they're able to articulate where the technology can go, and how receptive I think the provider organizations are to really kind of pushing the envelope and evolving kind of the ambient solution into kind of what it could be. Right? We spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about what is the value of ambient beyond documentation, like what does care look like once 90% of conversations are recorded. And I think in oncology in particular, like there are very unique opportunities, right? So I think right now, DeepScribe probably has around 60% of all community oncologists in the US, and I think by the end of this year we'll be far beyond that. And we're reaching a point where this question is really coming to a head, right? It's like, hey, like you now have a scenario where healthcare is unconstrained by documentation. It's not constrained by relying on a busy, burnt out physician harvesting the most important information about a patient and just documenting what they can remember or what they think is important. Right? You actually have kind of a full perspective in terms of the narrative that the patient has in that room, and figuring out what to do with that information, I think, is like the critical kind of existential question that we should all be asking right now. I think my perspectives on it is on oncology. There's a lot that we can do around just making sure that patients are on the right treatments, right? Being able to pull a lot of that information, matching that information with the genomic testing, matching that information with clinical pathways, matching that information with payer specific information to see if there's other biosimilars that are preferred by their payer, and presenting that information to the oncologist at the point of care to make sure that they're able to make the right decisions and be fully present in that room. That's where I think it can, like, one of the directions it can go, but like just to think about how impactful that would be for the oncologists and the patients. What it really requires is, one, like what you said, having a proper governance process. I think two, having a perspective where you want it to go, and then three, like just having trust in the partner to actually go along that journey with you, and making sure that a lot of those kind of I would say commercial terms that you discuss, or like there's more kind of creative ways to figure out how to fund these solutions, will work out. So
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one challenge here is the fact that there's sort of this golden opportunity now where our sort of big dominant EHRs that are used across all of our centers or all of our practices or whatever it is, they haven't like necessarily dipped their toe yet into these type of solutions. And you can imagine if and when they do, and Epic has already shown some signs of doing this, and we're an Epic shop at Emory, that becomes automatically like a challenge, because no matter how sophisticated a governance process we have, if Epic decides to turn it on, then that's what we're sort of subject to. And so
yeah,
there's this sort of golden opportunity right now where Epic hasn't turned it on. And so these type of relationships ought to be forged with Epic, Onca EMR, Cerner, whoever it may be, because once a solution is ingrained, then we get used to it. We start to fight for it. Honestly, like we've fought for tech-based solutions that have been threatened to turn off, whether it be for clinical decision support or prior auth support, because we know that it's useful and we don't want to see it turned off. We don't want to see vendor relationships go away. And so this is sort of an opportune moment that we shouldn't just wait for, because chances are when Epic turns on their stuff, I like Epic for the most part, but when something random gets turned on, it's automatically hated by like 100% of people, right when it starts turning on. And then, we get used to it. The only reason that 100% goes down to 50% is because we're forced to deal with it the whole course of the time, not because it's like the optimal solution. But it's just
yeah,
something that y'all are fighting against when this
I
type of stuff
completely
comes
agree.
around.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's why having a perspective on who you're building for and what you're building is really important, right? For us, we have focused especially in oncology because we believe that the complexities of cancer care and the unique needs of cancer care allow a robust set of differentiation that will allow us to you know show value beyond kind of a tool that was really built for anybody, right? And I think if you think about, like, we call it the ambient operating system at DeepScribe. So like all the other downstream kind of work that you can streamline or do once you actually have the ambient data, and also you're in the clinical workflow. I think that will manifest uniquely for oncology than it would for another specialty, or just if you were to build that kind of co-pilot system for, a health system, right? And I think the question is like, is the conviction that that is the right thing to do strong enough from both parties, both, the health provider organizations and the vendor, to really, be bold enough to go down that path? There's been a lot of conversation around how, like, Epic is going to kill all ambient scribe vendors, and, yada, yada, yada. And, I do think that, Epic is going to be one of those tools that will be used and will probably commoditize a lot of the ambient vendors that aren't specializing. A lot of the tools that are used by primary care or whatever the like. But as these kind of ambient vendors evolve into, whether they're revenue cycle or optimal therapy selection or clinical trials, whatever they might be, those opportunities they think are unique based off of what you're building for.
I think we really like when we have deep relationships, and then you, the vendor, comes in and says, "Hey, this is a feature that we can turn on tomorrow," as opposed to, another thing that has to go through another 6-month governance process. Here, you're a preferred vendor. Here's something we can turn on tomorrow that, can move from just straight dictation and maybe some clinical decision support into automated prior auth rebuttals, or automated, support for prior auth. Here's something that we can turn on that automatically turns into a revenue cycle management type of solution. And once that happens, then, that becomes a huge, again, way to ensure buy-in and advocacy, for the vendor-based solution, because it's like, we didn't even know this thing was possible, and now that we've seen it turn on, we're all in. And that also helps to fight against when, Epic turns on its ambient, solution. We say, no, we already have something. We have a bridge, we have DeepScribe, we have DAX, whatever it is. We're gonna stick with what we have because we trust it. And I think that first mover advantage is huge. But
Yeah.
it runs the risk of being cannibalized a little bit when it's sort of more of a point solution that, can easily be taken over by the behemoth.
So I really wanted to switch gears a little bit to one piece of research that you contributed to around the quantified worker. And I thought this was a really, really interesting concept that I think a lot of people are thinking about. And you just happened to actually do research and publish on this. Can you explain kind of what the quantified worker is?
Yeah, so I should note that, one, it was more of a thought piece that we put out there that's supported by some quantitative data that's out there. And two, the term quantified worker actually comes from a colleague of mine who's a lawyer here at Emory, Ifeoma Junior, who wrote a whole book about the quantified worker in the context of automated monitoring technologies for individuals at Amazon and other big corporations, and how technologies that are initially meant for the purpose to improve efficiency can eventually cause some downstream consequences for the very workers that they're intending to monitor. And so we don't have any case studies of this happening in the ambient space or in the in the general sort of automated monitoring space yet for physicians. But the concern that we brought up is that hospitals can access, through their relationships with ambient vendors, raw transcripts, ambient transcribed notes or AI generated notes. They can access, the final notes. They can access audio files with this emerging new technology, or it's been seen in some settings. And so, even though my note has never reflected any element of sort of quality in my interactions with patients, it hasn't, my ambient transcribed note doesn't reflect if I said something wrong, or if I, did something that shouldn't be there, or if I took too long for a patient or whatever it might be. That possibility is out there. And we as clinicians, most of us are employed, most of us are workers. And so we are usually subject to different types of external pressures, whether that be pressures to see more patients, to shorten visits. And many of us have gotten feedback, and there's published reports out there of physicians getting feedback when we're, say, taking too long with the patient visit, or when we're doing something else that can be monitored. And so when we introduce the content of a conversation as one of those things that can be monitored, does that open up the possibility for adverse consequences for us down the line? And should we be sort of formalizing our concerns about this in something that we called a clinician bill of rights early, even before it started to happen? Because same thing that Hollywood Hollywood writers did, same thing with other folks have done when they're faced with the possibility of AI-based disruption. And I would say that, the people who said that Hollywood workers were way too, negative, or way too, that concern was way too overblown whenever it happened a year or so ago, they're not saying that now. AI is like taking on a whole world of its own with content generation. And, I think we owe it to ourselves as workers and clinicians to be concerned about this early on, rather than just being oblivious to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a really interesting piece, and I think the analogies that you drew to Hollywood or to the Amazon factory, I think are real perspectives. I think like my perspective is a little bit more optimistic. I think and this is my own bias, right? Because I think I come from the world of technology, I come from the world of data, and I've seen firsthand the power that data can have on processes that in this case are in the service of taking care of patients. And I think this can do a lot for health equity and making sure that every patient is able to get a physician that is practicing at the top of their license. And I do think anyways, I think it would be interesting to get, I don't know, your take on like, how do you weigh that with like patient safety and the patient's concern, and like the Hippocratic oath that you took of saying, hey, like maybe I would want to see this data to help me take better care of my patients. And as a qualifier, what I will say is that like a lot of times when we talk to healthcare administrators, they're like, oh yeah, we can pay for ambient by forcing our doctors to see another patient, and I'm against that, right? Because I think that is like the pure antithesis of what we're trying to do. But I do think that like there's a more optimistic side of this story that I think is important to tell. And I'm curious to get your take on like, how do you weigh both, what the patient and what's right for the patient versus what's right for the employer?
Yeah, I think you're so right in, and my bias is clearly reflected in the fact that I'm a physician, and we're sort of concerned over what sort of an unanticipated impact on our own sort of practice and livelihoods could be. I fully acknowledge that element of things, it's not only possible, it might be the more likely thing to happen, in that certain quality metrics and things that we just haven't ever been able to sort of extract as quality metrics of a good doctor and a good doctor-patient relationship. Things like empathetic communication, and time spent like not typing on a computer, and all this other stuff that, you would want out of your own doctor. Now we have this ability to theoretically measure in some way. And that's a great thing. It opens up a whole new business line for you guys if you're ever going to think about, standard, like, reflecting high quality, clinical practice. And so that patients can have a good service, can trust their physician and trust their service a little bit more. I think it also clues us into whether there's any certain safety issues. And I've seen firsthand, by the way, that certain things that I might forget when I finally document my note, like, at night or a day later after my visit, the ambient has helped me to remember. So I remember to do something earlier for a patient. So I will fully admit that the benefits are far more likely, I think, than the risks. But I think we have to acknowledge the fact that, the ambient transcriber, it's not just recording one voice, it's recording the whole conversation. And so we just need to be cognizant of other times where monitored data has been used in some cases to the detriment of physicians. I mean, timestamp data in the EHR, which when EHRs were rolled out, we would have never envisioned that would have been used against us. That has been used in certain court cases as arguments against physicians, rightly or wrongly. It certainly is contributing to patient safety to surface errors when they happen. And yet and still, oftentimes it can be the doctor who's on the receiving end of some of those things. And so we just ought to be advocating for ourselves so that we can be sure that we're fully aware of when and if that's going to happen.
It's such an important conversation because ultimately, like we said earlier, the diffusion of a lot of this life changing technology really comes down on the bedrock of trust. And if there are a rising concern from the very users of this technology that it would be used ultimately against them, I think that could be very harmful in terms of being able to get this page technology out there. And I think it also depends on like how the product works, right? Like I think you had a really interesting research on when you are giving recommendations to a physician, the way that the nudge or the notification is written actually plays a dramatic role in terms of how that information is received. And so I think it's the same way with this, right? It's like we need to really figure out how to work in hand with the users in service of the patient to figure out how can we actually use this information to actually improve the lives of both the patients and the providers, so that rather than talking theoreticals of like, hey, like let's just steel man the worst side of the argument and steel man the best side of the argument. Let's I think really starting to pick the exact different types of use cases and figuring out like what should that notification be? Like, what should the ambient nudge for clinical trial matching should be? If there's a better therapy for the patient, and the provider is not aware of that. How should the vendor actually notify that doctor? And that's where I think is like the real special sauce that I think the work that you guys do at the HACLab is really powerful. So
Yeah, no, I think you've just articulated an awesome idea for a research project, and I'll send you the sponsored research agreement tomorrow, man. We'll make it happen.
All right, Robbie. I know we're almost out of time, and I had so much fun in this conversation. And there's so much that we could probably continue to talk to about. Maybe there will be a part two or something. But
Yeah, no, sounds
for
good,
now,
man. And thanks for hosting this. This is a great forum to talk through some of these concerns.
yeah, super exciting.